Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for joining us and welcome to this Bluetongue virus update webinar and Q&A session. Today is an opportunity for you to hear Bluetongue updates from our industry experts and also put forward any questions you might have about Bluetongue. My name is Zoe Lloyd. I'm an animal health and welfare scientist at AHDB, and I'm just going to be covering off a few housekeeping points before handing over to our chair for this evening, Sarah Miller from Quality Meat Scotland. I'm delighted to be joined today by some fantastic speakers. Firstly, we'll be hearing from Gustavo Simões, who is the Veterinary Advisor for Scottish Government, who will be going through some of the recent updates to the Scottish policy and an overview on Bluetongue. We will then move on to Gareth Owen, who is a dairy farmer from Lockerbie, who is going to talk us through some of his experiences and drivers for vaccinating against Bluetongue. We will then come back to myself, where I will be providing a very brief overview of the Battle Bluetongue campaign and the resources available to you. We are also delighted to have Gordon Hickman, who is the Head of Exotic Disease Policy for DEFRA, Jim Jack, who is the Bluetongue Policy Lead for Scottish Government, and Annabelle Henderson, who is the Exotic Disease Team Lead, also from Scottish Government, to help with the Q&A session at the end. If I could have the next slide, please. Just to cover off a few housekeeping points before we get started. So this webinar is being recorded and the link will be circulated within 24 hours to those who have signed up. If you do have any technical difficulties today, please know that the recording is being shared, so you will be able to watch it back. It will also be uploaded onto YouTube, so you are able to share with anyone who may have missed to tune in live. We will begin with an update of the current Bluetongue situation and policy from Gustavo, then move on to hearing from Gareth about his experiences, and then cover off the Bluetongue resources available on the AHDB and Ruminant Health and Welfare websites before moving on to questions at the end. Please note, if you would like to record your CPD for this webinar, you are very welcome to scan the QR code there in the corner, and this will hopefully make it a little bit easier for you to record. There will be the opportunity at the end to answer questions, so please do put your questions in the chat box at the top right-hand side of your screen. Here, there is a speech bubble with a question mark in it. At the end of the webinar, you will get the option to complete a feedback form where you can inform us of questions and topics you were interested in. We would really appreciate it if you could just take 2 minutes to fill this in. It really does help inform us of what you would like to hear more of. Please also keep an eye out on the Ruminant Health and Welfare and AHDB websites for future webinars too. Right, without further ado then, I will hand over to our chair for this evening, Sarah Miller. Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thanks, Zoe, and welcome everyone, and really looking forward to hearing the discussion and speakers this evening to give a bit of an overview of where we are up here in Scotland with regards to Bluetongue and some of the changes that are coming in on the 21st of September. So first up, we're going to give a bit of an overview on some of those changes and the kind of policy and evidence behind them from Gustavo. So I'm going to turn my microphone and camera off and hand over to Gustavo.
Thank you, Sarah and Zoe. I'm just going to share my screen and we'll run with a presentation. I hope that you are seeing now my slide and nothing else. If someone could confirm that you can see the slide, please, and I'll start.
Perfect. Yeah.
Thank you. So I'll start with the key takeaways I want you to take from this presentation. And I'll recap them in a little bit more detail at the end. So the main one is that the biggest risk transmission pathway for Bluetongue, which is midges biting animals and infecting other animals, becomes officially low risk in Scotland from the 21st of September. That means we will relax certain controls, meaning that quite a lot of animals that until this point have required pre-movement testing will no longer require. Breeding animals, because of persistence of virus in germinal products like semen or in breeding females, remain a risk and will need testing, or in the case of cattle, there is one vaccine which claims to prevent viremia in vaccinated animals if they become infected, and therefore those animals can be moved without testing. And we will do this through a general license, which should save industry and government administrative effort, meaning that people do not have to apply for a specific license. They just have to comply with the conditions of that license, and this will be monitored because we are trying to achieve a good balance between risk and enabling and facilitating trade that is proportionate and that relies on the cooperation of everyone. So just to give you a very quick snapshot of the current situation, on the right-hand side, you can see the map. The red outline is the entirety of England, which is a restricted zone for Bluetongue. You see all those little triangles in different colors, but roughly we have had roughly a third of the suspect cases have been confirmed. So we have had this season 23 confirmed cases and 62 negated. These figures are updated on a daily basis as cases happen. So this is the current snapshot. Moving on to talk a little bit about how Bluetongue spreads. So I mentioned the main transmission pathway is midges. So the vast majority of infections in terms of number is attributable to midges, and this depends on the availability of infected stock and in susceptible stock to be bitten by midges, and speed of spread at the local geographic level usually depends on stock density, the type of farming that occurs there, elevation and rainfall, anything that affects the midge's behavior. So it's all rather complex, but we know that wind can blow midges across large bodies of water, which is how BTV got here in the first instance. But now that it has established, we believe that all these new cases this year have been due to mechanisms of what's called as overwintering, which could be, for example, an infected female being pregnant and giving birth to an infected calf or lamb the next year, which then resumes the cycle. And this is probably what we are seeing now this year. Right now we are at probably peak transmission season, given the temperatures. The midge spread is very temperature dependent, and there will be a lag in detection of cases and possibly some underreporting. Not everyone will necessarily report a suspect case because it's not always obvious. So the true levels of infection may be higher than what's officially reported. We know this. It's factored into policy. The other aspect, and this is why a restricted zone exists to cover the area where there's local circulation. The risk from animals being moved is that they can take disease long distance and seed it in free areas. This is what we're trying to do with this policy of requiring animals to be tested before they come or be safe enough. And just to comment to say that the PCR test is very specific and very sensitive, so it's a highly trusted test. It doesn't mean that it's completely risk-free. We can have a test on one day, move the animal the next day, the animal gets infected that the day of the move. It's a risk that we do live in, and we're conscious of that, which is why we recommend that people bringing animals from a restricted zone also consider the risks to their herd or flock. And for example, if it's a high value animal like a breeding bull or a breeding ram, they may consider pre-breeding testing them just to be safe. I mentioned in utero infections as one of the most likely overwintering mechanisms, and just to comment this, of various other means of transmission which are not as important as midges or animal movements and reproductive transmission pathways. Now, to talk specifically about this incubation period, it's extrinsic because it's outside the animal. It's in the midge. So the midge bites an animal, and if the animal is infected, the virus needs to replicate in the midge's gut before it's capable of biting another animal and infecting it. So this is very temperature dependent, which is why Bluetongue is seasonal, which means that the climate, the weather affects not just the midge behavior, because they will eventually die off when it's too cold, but also this replication period, this incubation period in the midge. It's temperature dependent, and we have our excellent partners at the Pirbright Institute who do all these calculations for us. And generally, we can say that above 13 degrees Celsius is when the virus starts to replicate and is optimal at very comfortable temperatures of 20 to 30 degrees, which we have quite a bit this year. It is also affects the rate of spread, of replication. So at 13 degrees, it will be quite slow. It'll take a lot of time, e.g. 50 days to complete the cycle of replication, but at optimum it could be just as quick as 4 days. And again, our colleagues at Pirbright Institute talk about cumulative degree days, which is a combination of the time above that temperature, how many days above that temperature, and looks a little bit like this map. So this is a snapshot of Scotland with 2 warm weeks in this summer, and you can see the black areas are areas where if a midge had bitten an infected animal, would have been able to complete. Now, if we extend this to several months since March, then most of Scotland would have been able to facilitate the spread of infection through midges if infection had reached here. This is why we're trying so hard to keep it out. And again, thanks to our colleagues in the Animal Plant Health Agency and the Pirbright Institute for producing all this excellent scientific work. Now, just to give you a sense that essentially, given that the virus replication in the midge depends on temperature, we have this window in Scotland where this period of transmission can happen. And the next slide is the key principle for our relaxations come 21st of September. So to explain this chart now, if you think the height of these bars, it's the course of time over a year. So at the bottom, August, September, October. And in the last 17 years, the tallest bar, 11th of September, was the last date that if an animal infected came to Scotland and was bitten by a midge, that midge could go on and complete the incubation period. Now, this is all done based on the warmest points in Scotland and includes modeling of how virus behaves, including how temperatures are calculated. And also we need to take into account there could be microclimates, for example, inside buildings where it might be warmer. Therefore, uncertainty exists, and we add a buffer. And also the obvious fact that we don't know how warm it's going to be in the next months. So we've taken a decision to try to facilitate trade while keeping risk at a proportionate level, to set this date in advance so that those in the industry, in the sheep industry, in the cattle industry, who need to trade, they can plan in advance their sales in order to conduct these movements when it's less risky, and therefore we are a little bit more safer, and the trade can continue. So in addition to this, the work on modeling we have from Pirbright and EPHA, we have our colleagues, our partners at the EPIC Center for Expertise who conduct the risk assessments that underpin our policy decisions. And in conclusion, we know that the risk in all these circumstances that I've just explained, the risk of pregnant cows and heifers coming to Scotland are medium risk, but it's becomes low if these animals have been vaccinated with Bluetongue 3, which is that specific vaccine that specifically prevents viremia, which in cattle. We know that pregnant ewes have low risk, and this is mainly because the gestation is too short. So even if they do come infected, it would be a stretch for them to give birth to an infected lamb and still be in viremic by the time midges become active again. Breeding bulls in general are very low, but there's that red asterisk there, and they are negligible if vaccinated with Bluetongue 3, but this is a risk on an individual animal. So the impact of a single bull being infected and potentially infecting many females compounds the risks. So this is why we maintain controls on breeding bulls and breeding rams or taps. So just to explain that last point. So essentially, breeding animals are the only ones that remain required to be either tested or vaccinated when they come to Scotland from the restricted zone over this cold period. So just to recap what this all means. So store or fattening animals no longer need testing to come to Scotland. Abattoirs don't need to be designated anymore. Breeding tubs need testing before they come to Scotland. Breeding bulls need testing or be vaccinated with that specific vaccine. Pregnant ewes and goats do not need testing. Pregnant cows need testing or be vaccinated. And male and pregnant deer or camels need testing as well. And in general, vaccination is recommended. It's not mandatory, but it's highly recommended because the fact of the matter is, if BTV did come to Scotland, the impacts that we've seen in areas affected, particularly in the Netherlands or certain parts of England, there are true horror stories. If there's enough animals infected in a herd, you can have abortion, very severe fertility problems, very severe mortality in sheep in particular. So therefore, it is highly recommended that people do consider speaking to their vets and vaccinating. And that's thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Estavo, for that really strong overview of some of that kind of underlying modelling that has taken the decision to lead to the changes from the 21st of September. Just as something that I should have added at the start, we also had a webinar on Monday night with the Institute of Auctioneers in Scotland and the Beef Association that was more focused on Scottish farmers and talking just about some of those risks and rewards potentially of vaccination and some of the things that kind of go into that. The video from that webinar is available now online on the QMS social channels, and we're hoping to host another one into October once the rules have been relaxed and we've got a bit more information about how that has gone. So anyone interested in that, again, there's a bit more information there. Speaking of vaccination, though, I think we're going to head over to Gareth just now. Estavo, yeah, that's it, thank you. Gareth Farms in one of the kind of borderland regions of Scotland near Lockerbie, a dairy farmer. Gareth, you're just going to take us a bit through some of how you decided to undertake vaccination and some of the things that you had to think about as a business as part of that. So I'm going to hand over to you to give us the view from the field as it is.
Right. Thank you, Sarah. As Sarah says, we're a dairy farm just 6 miles over the border, just south of Lockerbie in Scotland. We currently milk 190 jerseys on 4 Lely robots. We're building our numbers back up since we've just sold our Holstein proportion of our herd off this summer. So for milk contract reasons, we also have our own about 130 to 140 followers on farm. Bluetongue, we've been discussing with the vet since last back end, since it kind of reared its head in the south of England, and sort of this spring and summer, in conjunction with our vets that we work with, we decided pretty early on actually that vaccination was the right route to go. So we have vaccinated everything down to about 3 months old on vet advice, because we thought we're better getting ahead of it now, because they thought the risk was as you get towards the back end, as the midges and that start moving up the country. So we vaccinated in June with the Baltavo 3 vaccine, along with the booster 3 weeks later. Obviously we had to handle all the animals and get them all jagged twice, but we saw no ill effects whatsoever. There was no milk drop, and all the cows that were vaccinated at that point, there was no drop off in insemination rate, and the preg rate has stayed basically the same, because all these animals have now been PD'd at this point, so nothing dropped off. The two main reasons we decided to vaccinate, as I say, with advice from the vet, I'm pretty big believer in prevention is better than cure. So if you can spend a little bit of money getting on top of this and basically saving yourself the worry of it before it becomes a problem, I think that's always the best way to work. It's also protecting your margins. I spoke to several people from the south coast of England that had had it in their area, and the anecdotal things I'd heard from there were horrific, to be honest with you. It was ranging from milk drops, from 5 to 8 litres a cow a day. And I sat and worked that out ourselves, and even at the lower end of that, at 5 litres, literally just the cost of the vaccine was paid off in about 3.5 days at that level of milk loss. So to me, it's a pretty much a no-brainer on that, and that doesn't even take into account the other effects that were mentioned beforehand, with the fertility and abortion and weight loss and stuff that come with it. So I would much rather prevent my animals from going through that, even if it is a small chance of it coming. I'd rather just make that pretty much a 0% chance. From a personal point of view, we're also, as I said, we've sold our Holsteins off, so we're trying to restock at the minute. And I have brought a few animals over from England, and it's far easier if they're vaccinated, to be honest with you. So you can get the license it pretty easily as long as the animal's fully vaccinated. The other element of it was, I think there's a bit of industry responsibility, in my opinion, that we need to, as farmers, be using every tool that's available to us. I think it would probably make Scottish Government's life a lot easier if everybody was vaccinated, both sides of the border, to be honest, and then we'd probably lose a lot of these controls. And it's a lot easier as an industry trying to, if we've used everything available to us, to try and prevent the problems that are coming because of this vaccine. Whereas if we sit on our hands and don't vaccinate, it's a bit of, well, you had the opportunity to not make it happen. So yeah, I would thoroughly advise everybody to be at least speaking to the vet about this. And as I said before, we've had no ill effects whatsoever from that vaccine. It was a bit of hassle for 2 days running everything through, getting them vaccinated. It's an intramuscle one, so it's nice and easy. And yeah, I suppose, Sarah, that's pretty much me. I don't, I would just recommend everybody does their best and does the responsible thing, really.
Thanks, Gareth. And I think you've summarised that really, really well. That that choice to vaccinate absolutely got to be every individual business's, considering those risks. And I think one of the things that we've been discussing as a wider Scottish industry is what does that industry level risk analysis look like, particularly when we look forward to next year, because there's no doubt that some of the movement restrictions that we have had have caused economic challenge, and part of that industry responsibility is balancing up the economic with the need to protect the Scottish herd. As you've heard in flocks, as you've outlined there, some of the stories coming out of the south of England and over in the continent where this has, gotten a hold have been really quite terrifying. We don't want that. And it's that balance, making sure that next year we can continue to protect Scottish herds and flocks, whilst continuing to minimise any potential economic challenges as well. So it's a real challenge, and I know Scottish Government have been working really hard with others to try and get that sweet spot. moving over to Zoe now from AHDB. So AHDB have got some fantastic assets from their Bluetongue campaign. Zoe, do you want to just give us a bit of an overview of what you guys have, where it's available? And I think if everyone can start thinking about questions as well, we'll be moving on to the questions after that. So there's not any in the question box yet, so we'll give everyone a few minutes head start to start thinking.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Sarah. I will just be going through a very quick overview of some of the resources and tools we have available. All of these you will be able to find on either the Ruminant Health and Welfare or AHDB websites, and you can also scan the QR codes on screen to go directly to the tool as we go along. So first, here on the screen we have the Bluetongue Movements Checker on the left. We designed this tool to help farmers navigate those cross-border movements in GB. So this tool will ask you where you are, whether that's in England, Wales or Scotland, and ask where you wish to move to, whether that's a abattoir, market, show or another farm. And from here, it will inform you of what licenses you need, whether you need pre-movement test and other important factors to consider depending on the scenario you select. And then next on screen, we have the Is it too late to vaccinate tool. This is the tool that Fiona Lovett from Flock Health Limited developed and shared on the last webinar on the 20th of August. And this is a really useful resource that you can use to work out the last date to vaccinate bulls and rams for the best breeding protection against bluetongue. Depending on the brand of bluetongue vaccine, particularly with sheep, some vaccines require 1 dose and others 2. So you will need to take this into consideration when determining timings on when to vaccinate with respect to breeding, and this tool can really help with that. If I could have the next slide, please. And then here we have another set of really useful tools. So on the left, we have the vaccination cost calculators there. So these are bespoke calculators available for sheep, beef and dairy cattle, available on the AHDB website. These are designed to provide a figure for how much it would cost you to vaccinate your stock. And then you can compare this figure with an estimation for how much it would cost if you saw bluetongue on your farm. So this takes into consideration mortality, fertility and production losses based off what has been seen so far in the UK and Europe. And then we have the vaccine comparison tables. These are really useful if you're looking to compare the different vaccine properties. It might be that you are considering vaccinating and have the choice of more than one vaccine, and you'd like to find out more about the individual vaccines and their claims. So these tables are really ideal for that. And we compiled these together with the vaccine companies and industry, and they do get updated too, so definitely check those out. Another tool I haven't included on screen here, but again is also part of the Battle Bluetongue campaign, is the Bluetongue Decision Maker tool. So this really helps you decide whether vaccination is the right choice for your farm and helps you work out which stock to prioritise. So this tool works based off your farm location, the prevalence of disease in your area, the expected value of your stock on farm, and what stage in the breeding cycle you might be in, as well as numerous other factors. So that's the Decision Maker tool, which is also available on the Ruminant Health and Welfare website, so definitely go check that one out too. It is really important that if you are considering vaccinating your stock to speak to your vet. It is not too late to vaccinate. However, it is far better to have this conversation sooner rather than later and to protect your stock in the 2025-26 vector season, as Gareth mentioned earlier in his reasoning for vaccinating. We are aware that there are rumours and misinformation circulating about bluetongue and the vaccines, so we have developed myth-busting posts which Laura Stephen and Fiona Lovett went into detail with on the webinar on the 20th of August. This is also available on YouTube, so please do check that out too. If I could have the next slide, please. And then here I have just included some really useful links that are handy to keep an eye on. So at the top there, we have the AHDB Bluetongue webinars page. This gets updated regularly with new and upcoming webinars. So please do keep an eye on this if you're interested in registering for future webinars. And the second one here is the Ruminant Health and Welfare Bluetongue Hub. There is an absolute wealth of resources and tools available here, both for farmers and vets. One of which is the FAQs, which takes me into the third bullet point here. There are a whole range of FAQs available, and we do keep adding to them too. So please do check these out if you have any queries. If I could have the next slide, please. I just wanted to highlight here that we have our next webinar on the 17th of September, 5 till 6 p.m. So please do sign up for this via the AHDB website that I shared earlier. We also do have a new question submission form available. This is available on the AHDB webinars page and through the QR code here on screen. This allows you to submit questions for future webinars, and there are also some really useful contacts and resources available via this form. If you have submitted a question through this form and it hasn't been answered on the webinar series, possibly due to time constraints, please do check out the FAQs page mentioned earlier, because it's highly likely that we have produced an FAQ on your question. If I could have the next slide, please. There is also lots of additional support available to you if you are struggling or know of somebody who is. These organisations are also available on the Ruminant Health and Welfare website for you to find out more. And then if I could have the last slide, please. And then lastly, this has been very much an industry initiative, and I would really like to say a big thank you to all who have been involved. All of your support has been incredibly vital in getting the resources out there and helping farmers with a decision on whether to vaccinate or not. So that's everything from me. Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thanks, Zoe, and it's great to see those resources and getting shared far and wide, because the more we can get that consistent messaging out is so important to help battle some of that myth bursting, as you said. So we've now got about 29 minutes exactly for questions, so lots of time to answer any questions that anyone has. On the chat box, we've just got an initial question that's come through. The latest updates from DEFRA indicate most cases in England are single or low number of infections in a herd or flock. Do we know why the morbidity levels are so low in these infected flocks or herds? And if I could ask the speakers to come back on the screen, please. So I don't know who wants to take that, whether Gordon or Estavo.
I mean, maybe if I kick off and then Esther or others want to come in. I think the thing to say is that we don't know yet whether the flock level of morbidity will remain that low. This follows the pattern that actually the Netherlands saw very early on in the season, with relatively low within flock and within herd prevalence, and then it got worse as the season progressed and in the second year. And secondly, the way that we are confirming disease, we're only testing up to 3 animals, and we're not yet going back to identify whether there's been subsequent increase in morbidity as the EIP sort of kicks in within that flock or herd. So we'll only know that later on. And if you look at some of the impact work from last season, we had that same pattern, but actually when you looked back, more animals were affected in subsequent weeks. So I think it's too early to say that it's definitely low morbidity. We just don't have the data yet.
Perfect. Thank you, Gordon. And Estavo, is there anything you'd want to add to that from a Scottish Government perspective?
As a veterinarian rather than Scottish government, I think absolutely right what Gordon is saying, and based on the studies that we've seen from last year, my opinion is entirely dependent on the actual rate of infection on farm. So inherently, we know this virus can cause severe impacts on albeit mortality in sheep, which a case fatality rate could be as high as 70-80%, and with case studies where we know there was lots of infected animals, a big proportion of, say, breeding stock in a cattle farm, they've had situations like 50% loss of reproductive losses. So it probably depends on how many get infected in the first place, and that is then affected by other factors. Could be the weather, could be the habitats for midges, etc.
Just keeping on that theme, and I think this next question probably does come to you, Estabo. How big a risk does Scotland think rams vaccinated with Baltavo 3 will bring to Scotland if they are not pre-movement tested? For example, will rams vaccinated with Baltavo 3 be allowed into Scotland later in the year, as will happen in Wales from September 21st? If we double vaccinated our rams with Baltavo 3, will that make any difference even later in the autumn?
So the honest answer is we don't exactly know, because that has not been tested. We believe that is being tested, and maybe as the manufacturers of Baltavo 3 update on their dossier that they submit to the Veterinary Medicines Directorate, they will possibly provide information to that respect. We can only go by what is officially published through the data sheet and the dossier that's submitted through the Veterinary Medicine Directorate, which is why, and in my opinion, we're being precautious with the rams. It is quite likely that they are less risky than non-vaccinated animals. That's the point of vaccinating in the first place. But we cannot guarantee that they're safe. Whereas in cattle, the double dose of Baltavo 3 guarantees, according to the manufacturer, there's absence of viremia, so there's no virus for the midge to pick up, whereas it doesn't do the same in sheep. It may be that it is the case in the future, but we cannot say that at this moment in time. And on the side of the risk of Bluetongue transmission in semen in particular, we know that you can detect a virus in semen potentially for months after the animals had an infection. Therefore, we're being precautious with that aspect of the transmission. That's why we asked them to be tested. But yeah, that's that.
Perfect. And just part of what you were talking about in your slides, Estabo, I think this question will be for Gordon, but the weather and warmth has obviously an impact on midges. We know that particularly well here in Scotland, the midge capital of the UK. But this is a question about the south of England. Have we in the south of England escaped the Bluetongue bullet this year because of the very hot, dry summer suppressing midge numbers in a way, as many of their normal environments and wet areas around Dunkeeps, etc., have dried out? Will that have an impact, Gordon, do you think, looking at overwinter into next year?
I mean, I think we probably need to seek some advice from our herb experts on that. It certainly won't have hurt in terms of those habitats, but we know we've got circulating virus, we know we've got midges, and we know we've got the temperatures to support that EIP, as Estavo says. So yes, you've got a typical 2 to 3 week cycle. So just because we haven't seen it yet doesn't mean to say that we won't get it. And as you know, all of the modelling predictions are that the highest numbers will happen in September. So I think we've got to be really careful to suggest we've already missed the worst of it. I mean, I hope we have, but I think we've got to be really careful.
And I'm conscious we've also got Jim Jack and Annabel Henderson from Scottish Government on the call as well. We've got a question that was actually submitted beforehand. If you suspect a positive case of BTV3, you need to report, but do you also need to test? Do one of you want to take that from that question that was submitted beforehand?
I can take that if you want, Sarah. So in Scotland, any suspicion of Bluetongue, any clinical suspicion must be reported to the Animal Plant Health Agency. It is a legal requirement for anyone suspecting a notifiable disease like Bluetongue, and it will receive an investigation from an APHA field vet, who will then decide whether the case can be negated on farm because they've reached a differential diagnosis, or whether samples need to be taken. So any case that cannot be negated will receive a testing.
So in England, it's slightly different, as you know. So again, it's a legal requirement to report suspicion of disease. APHA then undertake a triage process to ensure that the clinical presentation of that case isn't suggestive of foot and mouth disease or other notifiable diseases. If they're content that those can be ruled out, then we offer a free test, not a free sample, but that is voluntary. We would very, very strongly encourage people to take advantage of that testing opportunity, but it's not mandatory that they do that. We're obviously monitoring the number of, if you like, codes that we've given out for a test and haven't been taken up. And we're trying to understand why people don't go forward with that. Sometimes they've done other tests and found a differential, and sometimes I guess there could be a practical or a cost constraint to that. So I hope that answered the question. You don't have to test it, but we would really, really strongly recommend everyone does, because clearly it was bad enough to report disease in the first place, and everyone really wants to know what that is causing those clinical signs.
Perfect. Thanks, Gordon. And we've got a question coming in from one of the vets on the webinar. Can you give any indication as to the distribution of clinical cases in the UK? Are they, for example, all clustered around the south, the east, or is it a fairly even spread? I'm not sure who wants to take that one.
So there is a case map on the website, the DEFRA website. If you go into the Bluetongue latest situation, there's some of the latest cases, and then there's a link there that takes you to a case map. You can see where all those cases are. There's also a separate layer to see where last season's cases were. There's a hot spot in the home counties, if I can put it that way. There's a developing sort of warm spot in Hampshire, but there's cases in Cheshire, or a case in Cheshire. There's a case in Staffordshire. There's nothing in the southwest at the moment, and there's not much in the eastern counties, but we're worried that people are just not reporting. So just because there isn't a case doesn't mean to say that there isn't circulating virus there.
Perfect. And moving just a bit more onto a kind of practical question, is it worth double vaccinating rams and bulls if they were done in early summer, several months apart in the first year, given that high value in being half the flock and herd? Is that a consideration?
I'll take that. So it's certainly something that should be discussed. We encourage a discussion with the vet. We cannot say it's recommended because that would be off-label. So the label for the vaccination in rams is a single dose. I'm referring to the Boltavo one. So therefore, it should be a discussion with the private vet.
So that aligns really well with what Gareth was saying around taking advice from vets and looking at individual business decisions. A bit more of a horizon scanning kind of question. Is there any news on any other serotypes of Bluetongue starting to emerge?
I'll start, maybe Gordon wants to add. There are 24 known serotypes, and they are spread across the world. Right now, there's 4 different ones in Europe. UK has mostly Bluetongue serotype 3, which is what's been most concerning, but there was a detection of serotype 12 last year in England as well, a single case, which is also present in Europe, as is serotype 4 and serotype 8. So it has worldwide distribution, the disease itself, but there's many different serotypes. And there's ongoing horizon scanning and scanning surveillance systems across countries, across the world. There's reporting to the World Animal Health Organization. So these serotypes are currently or constantly monitored and analyzed and surveyed. So the answer is yes. There are, if any new serotype were to appear, would be detected quickly.
So I think just to add to what Esteban says, so we're obviously most worried about BTV8 because there is very active transmission in France, within those sort of areas where they are within the possibility that they could be blown across. I think last time I looked, there were nearly 2,000 cases in France alone, some up as far as the Brittany area. And as Esteban says, we're monitoring for other threats. We should also say that our testing would also identify other Bluetongue serotypes. So a negative Bluetongue test means that none of those other serotypes are present in that animal. We do 2 tests, in effect, a pan serotype, looking at all serotypes, and then we home in on the diagnostic test, the default position being that Bluetongue 3 test. And that's how we found the Bluetongue 12 in our last year's annual surveillance. We got a positive pan serotype, but negative on 3. So Pirbright then went and looked to see what it was. So I think Bluetongue 8 is the one we're worried about next.
And going a bit back to strategy, why do we have a restricted zone rather than the zones set out in the Bluetongue strategy, which states if Bluetongue is confirmed, a restricted zone, including a protection zone with a radius of at least 100 kilometres and a surveillance zone with a depth of at least 50 kilometres beyond the protection zones, will be declared. Does anyone want to give just a bit of insight into how that strategy has evolved and diverged over the last 12 months?
So, I mean, maybe I'll kick off from an England perspective, because it may be that Scotland do go down that route. But obviously, we were in a very different set of circumstances when we got that first case. So if you go back 2 years ago, we had that those couple of incursions very late on in the season. And so our approach there was actually to look to contain disease. So we did a lot of culling. We put in place very, very onerous restrictions. It was actually a temporary control zone we went, because we didn't have the evidence of circulating virus initially. And legally, a PZSZ taken together is a restricted zone. And so we decided that because the conditions for the controls are very similar between a PZ and an SZ, and you would have to test to go from a PZ into an SZ, and then you would have to test again to go from an SZ into the free area. The impacts on keepers within those zones were disproportionate to having a single restricted zone where you have to, in effect, test out. So we were still containing disease in that restricted zone, but we chose to put in place slightly smaller zones and then to progressively extend them to manage that impact on keepers within the zone, but offset that against containing disease and keeping it out of Scotland and Wales and the high dense areas. So that was our logic and thought process that we went through in the last year. And obviously we've got to the point now where those restricted zones from an England perspective are disproportionate in terms of the impact. And so we've now gone for an England RZ. Hope that helps sort of explain some of the thought process that we went through.
Yeah, really useful. I don't know, Estavo, Annabelle or Jim, whether you guys have got anything you want to add from a Scottish perspective.
I can add that the considerations, if there were to be an incursion in Scotland, would be very, very similar, and we're grateful for their efforts in trying to keep it away. And the key, I think there's a key point to say that legislation enables different types of zones for the different moment of the disease. So on initial period of an outbreak, you might want to have a type of zone. Later than when you know a lot more about the outbreak, and you know where it is, you might want a different type of zone. And if we did have an incursion to Scotland, we'd be mindful of lots of things, but the first aspect we try to consider would be, does this mean there is local circulation? Are the midges in Scotland infected? And if so, then the risk is different than it would be if it was an imported animal that we were able to detect in time and contain disease before it has a chance to become established. So we monitor it continuously and would put an appropriate zone for the appropriate period and amount of knowledge that we have at the time.
Thanks, Gustavo. And just a little housekeeping. I see there's a couple of hands going up. I think, if I remember Zoe's briefing earlier, I did listen to it, I promise. The only way we're able to take questions is through the question box, which is on the right-hand side of your screen, the little kind of speech bubble with a question mark. So if you would like to ask a question, please just pop it in there, and we'll make sure it gets answered. I've got a question I think actually might be for Zoe, because I know again in that briefing that I listened to very diligently, he spoke a bit about vaccination and taking some of the questions that had been asked earlier back to some of the vaccine companies to get a bit more information. So this one kind of fits into that. Do the vaccine companies have any comment to make about revaccination going forward into 2026? So I'm not sure if that's one someone wants to take, or Zoe, whether that's one you want to take away for the kind of follow-up FAQ.
Yeah, I'm quite happy to take that away and create a follow-up FAQ on that. But equally, if anyone has any sort of insights into that or any thoughts around that, yeah, quite happy to hear.
I can come in. First of all, the Bluetongue vaccination, it's a technology that's been around for quite a while, and there should be a reasonable amount of confidence that the duration of immunity will be at least 1 year. It just has not been proven because right now they are running those trials. They have to vaccinate the animals and challenge them with a virus and then test them and so once that is completed, the manufacturers will submit the dossiers for the Veterinary Medicines Directorate and make it official what's the vaccination period and other changes to how it's administered, etc., if there are any. But just to say, we have a good, reasonable confidence that they will go in that direction.
Thank you. And we will follow up on some of these questions as well, like we said, with the FAQ. I'm conscious we've got about 8 minutes left. I will give everyone a couple of minutes just to submit any final questions into the question box. Gareth, you've been sitting there very quiet. Just thinking about, you're obviously a farmer, very much on the ground in the border area of Scotland. What are the questions that you're kind of maybe having, and what's the pub chat with fellow farmers about Bluetongue in Scotland, and what, if anything, you've got Scottish Government, DEFRA, AHDB, QMS here on the call, what do you feel that you need more of to help inform decision making at that local farm level?
Well, I think sometimes you're as a farmer, you're just sort of reacting to the legislation that comes out. It'd probably be quite nice to have a kind of roadmap that would be there if you achieved a certain level of vaccination, something like that. So there's a bit of an incentive to get people to uptake the vaccine a bit better, because I think that there is still, among some of my friends anyway, it's the cost benefit of it, and they think, oh, it's an English problem, it's not coming up here. But I think I worked it out. It's between £5 and £6 a cow. It's quite a cheap insurance policy for vaccination anyway. But yeah, it's frustrating, especially where I am, just over the border and no more, that there's essentially this economic wall has been built, but for very understandable reasons. And yeah, I quite support it, but it's, from a business point of view, it is quite frustrating that I can bring animals from away up north quite easily, but it takes quite a lot of paperwork to bring them 15 miles over the border, say. So yeah, I think just as I say, a kind of roadmap would be nice, but I understand these things move, so it's maybe not just just as easy as that to do.
Brilliant. And I think it's always really useful just to kind of sense check what, because there's lots of times as organisations we think we're hearing what farmers need, but I often like just asking, exactly what it is that people are hearing on the ground. We have had one final question come through, so we'll maybe take this one and then start just to do a bit of a vote of thanks and finish up. If the restricted zone includes the protected zone and the surveillance zone, should this have a minimum radius of 150 kilometres? If so, a large part of Wales and part of Scotland would be captured. There are also considerations re vaccinations, which is not normally permitted in the surveillance zone. Estavo, Gordon, anyone want to take that?
So it's the PZSZ combined is the RZ. So if you like, the border of the RZ is the equivalent of the edge of the surveillance zone. So you don't have to go another 150 kilometres on top of that. So so the border is Wales and the border is Scotland. And Wales have allowed vaccination in Wales. I obviously can't speak on behalf of Welsh policy, but vaccination is allowed under Welsh legislation in Wales.
Perfect.
As
Thank
is in
you.
Scotland.
Perfect. No, thank you very much for that, both Gordon and Estavo. And I think I don't see any questions coming through on the question chat, so I think we'll take the prerogative and start to move to a close. So just a massive thank you from me on behalf of both ourselves and AHDB to Gareth, Gordon, Estavo, Jim and Annabelle for giving up their evening to come and share what has been really, really important insights. And I think it's one of these things that we can't do enough of, to make sure that we are talking, sharing information across both sides of the border and continuing to make sure that we are aligning what the most recent information and evidence says with what the needs of industry are. So the more that we can do this, the better. As Zoe said, the next webinar that AHDB are running is going to be on the 17th of September. For anyone who is more interested in what Scotland are doing, as I said earlier, the recording from the Scottish Industry webinar is available now online, if anyone wants to go and watch that. And like I say, we will be hosting another one again later on to October that everyone is most welcome on as well, if they are particularly interested in Scotland. Other than that, this is what I would normally say. I wish everyone a safe journey home, but hopefully everyone is just about to move over to their tea tables. So hope everyone has a good evening, and thank you all again for joining us.
Thank you very much, Sarah.